The train from Milan to Rome left at 7:14 in the morning. James Okafor had been in Italy for 11 days. He is 34, an economist by training, working now for a Brussels-based policy institute that studies structural change in European economies. He had been sent to Italy to look, to listen, and to report that his colleagues in Belgium would read in a glass-fronted office and probably never fully believe. He had a notebook full of observations. He had photographs. He had interviews recorded on his phone. Factory owners in Bergamo, a fashion buyer in Milan, a retired civil servant in Naples who had laughed for 30 seconds when James asked him about government efficiency before realizing the question was serious. What he did not have sitting in the first-class carriage of a train that was running 40 minutes late through countryside of almost hallucinatory beauty was a simple answer. The problem, he wrote in his notebook somewhere between Bologna and Florence, is that Italy is the most beautiful argument against itself I have ever seen. He underlined it. Then he looked out the window. Outside, the hills of Tuscany rolled past in the low autumn light, amber and ochre, and a green so deep it seemed implausible, the kind of color a painter invents when they are trying too hard. Ancient villages sat on ridgelines exactly where ancient villages should sit. Cypress trees lined roads that had been lined with cypress trees since before the concept of a road existed in most of the world. And James thought about the numbers he carried in his notebook. Youth unemployment above 20%, GDP per capita lower in real terms than it was in the year 2000. A national debt approaching 3 trillion euros, roughly 140% of GDP, a population shrinking faster than almost any other in the developed world, more Italians emigrating each year than at any point since the 1970s. The train arrived in Rome 53 minutes late. "Beautiful country," the man in the next seat said, gathering his bag. In Italian, perhaps 60, in an excellent suit. He said it without irony, without bitterness, almost without feeling, the way you say something you have said so many times it has stopped being a statement and become a reflex. James wrote it down anyway. This is a film about the gap between that sentence and those numbers, about a country that built something extraordinary, a civilization of taste, craft, beauty, and industrial ingenuity that the world cannot stop consuming, and somehow cannot make the books balance. About why Italy matters more than its headlines suggest, and why the distance between what Italy is and what Italy could be may be the most expensive gap in Europe. To understand Italy's economy, you have to start with something that does not appear in most economics textbooks: the organized production of beauty. Other countries make things the world needs. Italy makes things the world wants. That distinction, which sounds philosophical, turns out to be one of the most commercially potent positions in the global economy. Consider what Italy actually exports. Ferrari produces fewer than 14,000 cars per year. 14,000 for a planet of 8 billion people. By any industrial logic, this is an absurdly small output for a company worth more than $50 billion on the stock exchange. But Ferrari does not sell transportation. It sells a specific feeling, the feeling of being the kind of person who drives a Ferrari. And that feeling, carefully rationed, carefully maintained, depreciates less than almost any other luxury asset on Earth. A Ferrari is not consumed, it appreciates. And it was designed, engineered, and hand-assembled in Maranello, in the Po Valley, by people who learned to do this from people who learned to do this from people who had been doing this, in one form or another, since before the car existed. That is not a product, that is a civilizational inheritance monetized. The fashion and luxury sector extends the logic across an entire economy. Gucci, Prada, Versace, Armani, Bottega Veneta, Bulgari, Moncler, Brunello Cucinelli. These are not separate companies that happen to be Italian. They are expressions of a single national competency, the ability to make physical objects that carry cultural authority. To make a shoe and have the world agree that this shoe means something. To make a bag and have its construction, the leather, the stitching, the hardware, the proportions, communicate a set of values that a buyer in Tokyo or Sao Paulo or Dubai recognizes and pays for without needing an explanation. Italy's fashion and luxury exports account for roughly 100 billion euros per year. The country is the world's second largest exporter of fashion products. In certain categories, leather goods, eyewear, silk, ceramic tiles, certain categories of furniture, Italy holds market positions that its rivals have spent decades trying to erode and largely failed. But the deeper story is not the brands. It is what sits beneath the brands. In Prato, outside Florence, there is a textile district that has been producing cloth for 700 years. The wool merchants of Prato financed the Renaissance. Their descendants now run mills that supply the world's luxury houses with fabrics of a quality that cannot be replicated at scale elsewhere. Not because of machines, but because of accumulated human knowledge that lives in the hands and eyes of workers who have been doing this their whole lives, in a town where their parents did it before them. In the Brenta Riviera near Venice, 300 shoe factories occupy a 20-kilometer stretch of riverbank. They make shoes for Christian Dior and Celine and Louis Vuitton and Chanel, shoes that carry French brand labels but Italian soles. The leather is cut by craftsmen whose grandfathers cut leather. The lasts are carved by people who know what a last should feel like in a way that cannot be downloaded or automated or offshored without losing the thing that makes the shoe worth what it costs. This is Italy's hidden economic architecture. Not the logos at the top, but the ecosystem underneath. The tanneries, the weavers, the metal workers, the glass blowers, the ceramicists, the specialist machine tool makers who build the equipment that produces the goods that no one else can produce quite this way. A country of craftsmen who became industrialists, who became the invisible backbone of global luxury. James Okafor spent a day in Prato and filled half a notebook. Then he went back to his hotel and looked at the numbers again, trying to reconcile what he had seen with what the data said. He could not, quite. That was the Italian problem in miniature. The paradox of Italy is not mysterious if you look at it long enough. It is a country with extraordinary productive assets and a structural inability to convert those assets into broad prosperity. The beauty is real. The craftsmanship is real. The exports are real. And yet the aggregate numbers tell a story of stagnation so persistent it has begun to feel permanent. There are 4 reasons. Each one is serious. Together, they are suffocating. The first is productivity, or the absence of it. Italy's GDP per capita in real terms is lower today than it was in 2000. This is a statement so striking that it bears repeating. A quarter-century of economic activity has produced, net of inflation, essentially no increase in average living standards. Italy is not a poor country. Its nominal wealth, accumulated over generations, remains vast. But it is a country that has stopped generating new wealth at the pace that modern economies require. The core of this problem is productivity growth, and the core of the productivity problem is the structure of Italian business. The country's economy is built around very small firms, micro-enterprises of fewer than 10 employees that account for nearly half of all private sector employment. These firms are often family-owned, often located in sectors where tacit knowledge matters more than scale, and often operated with a preference for continuity over expansion that reflects deep cultural values about the relationship between a family, a business, and a community. This is also why Italian luxury exists in the form it does. The small firm, the family workshop, the generational knowledge. These are the conditions under which extraordinary craftsmanship survives. But small firms, almost by definition, invest less in technology, adopt digital tools more slowly, train workers less systematically, and access capital markets less efficiently than large ones. The very structure that produces Prado's textiles and Brenta's shoes also produces Italy's productivity gap. The second is debt. Italy's national debt stands at approximately 2.9 trillion euros, roughly 140% of GDP, the third highest ratio in the developed world after Japan and Greece. This debt is not new. It accumulated during the 1970s and 1980s, when Italy ran structural deficits to finance a welfare state expansion that created entitlements the economy has never been fully able to afford. The interest payments alone absorb roughly 65 to 70 billion euros per year, money that does not go to schools, infrastructure, research, or the digital transition that Italy's economy urgently needs. The debt is also a political trap. Any government that seriously attempts to address it through spending cuts faces immediate social conflict, because the beneficiaries of the spending are also the voters. Any government that attempts to grow out of it faces structural constraints on growth that are, as described above, deeply embedded. Italy has had more than 60 governments since 1945, an average of one every 13 months, and virtually every one of them has eventually reached the same impasse. The problem is real, the solution is painful, and the political system makes the pain nearly impossible to distribute. The third is demography, the most invisible emergency. Italy had a birth rate of approximately 1.2 children per woman in recent years, among the lowest recorded in the developed world and well below the 2.1 replacement rate. Its population is aging faster than almost any other European country. By 2050, projections suggest that there will be more Italians over 65 than under 30. The economic implications of this are not abstract. They mean a shrinking labor force supporting a growing pension obligation, a healthcare system under intensifying pressure, a consumer base that spends differently and less dynamically, and, perhaps most damagingly, a signaling problem. Young Italians confronted with an economy that appears to offer them less than it offered their parents are leaving. The phenomenon called fuga dei cervelli, the brain drain, is not new in Italy, but it has accelerated. Between 2011 and 2023, more than 1 million Italians between the ages of 18 and 34 emigrated permanently. These are disproportionately the educated, the ambitious, precisely the people who might otherwise build the startups, run the hospitals, design the systems, and pay the taxes that an aging country needs. They go to London, to Berlin, to Amsterdam, to Zurich, and most of them do not come back. James interviewed 3 of them in a single afternoon in a cafe in Milan, all in their late 20s, all with engineering or economics degrees, all planning to leave within the year. None of them were angry. They were something harder to argue with. Calm. "I love Italy," one of them said, a woman named Chiara, who had a job offer in Munich she was going to accept. "I will always love Italy, but love is not a pension." The fourth is the state itself. Italy's public administration is, by the measurement of virtually every international institution that has studied it, the World Bank, the OECD, the European Commission, the IMF, one of the slowest, most legally complex, and least digitally capable in the developed world. Starting a business in Italy takes longer than in France, Germany, Spain, or the Netherlands. Resolving a commercial dispute through the courts takes an average of more than 3 years. Tax compliance requires navigating a code of such labyrinthine complexity that large Italian companies routinely employ more tax lawyers than engineers. Public investment projects, when approved, are implemented at a fraction of the speed of comparable projects in Northern Europe. This is not a character failing of Italian people, who are, as James observed throughout his 11 days, industrious, intelligent, and deeply capable of organizing complex things when the institutional context permits. It is a structural feature of a state that accumulated layers of legislation, bureaucracy, and legal challenge over decades without ever having a serious rationalization. The result is a machine that works beautifully in some places. The fashion districts, the export corridors, the tourist infrastructure of the historic centers, and almost nowhere else with the same reliability. When James described this to the factory owner in Bergamo, a man who made precision components for the aerospace industry and had been in business for 31 years, the man nodded slowly, as if James had said something he had known since birth. "We succeed," the man said, "not because of the system, despite it." He said it without bitterness. That, James thought, was the saddest part. Italy is not Greece. This point is important, and it is consistently underestimated by those who write about Italian decline from a distance. Italy is the third largest economy in the Eurozone and the eighth largest in the world. Its industrial base, particularly in the north, remains genuinely formidable. Its export sector is competitive. Its household wealth, accumulated over generations of frugality, is among the highest in Europe. Italian households are, by net wealth per capita, significantly richer than German ones. The country has not collapsed. It has, to use the precise and slightly terrifying word, stagnated. But stagnation in an economy of Italy's size does not stay contained. Italy holds approximately 2.9 trillion euros of public debt, most of it held by Italian banks, Italian insurance companies, and the European Central Bank. If Italian sovereign debt ever moved into genuine crisis, not the near miss of 2011, but a full disruption of market confidence, the transmission to the rest of the Eurozone would be rapid, deep, and very difficult to contain. France, Germany, and Spain all have meaningful financial exposure to Italy, directly and indirectly. The ECB's entire post-2012 framework of backstop commitments, Mario Draghi's whatever it takes, was built in large part around the implicit understanding that Italy could not be allowed to fail. That backstop has held, but it is a backstop, not a solution. It manages the risk, it does not eliminate it. The strategic implications extend beyond finance. Italy controls the central Mediterranean, its coastline, its ports, its air bases, and its political stability are all components of European security architecture that NATO and the EU have long taken for granted. And Italy destabilized by prolonged economic underperformance, by youth unemployment, by emigration, by the political volatility that economic frustration reliably produces, is a different Italy than the one European planners have built their assumptions around. The far-right coalition that governs Italy today is not, in most of its economic policies, dramatically different from its predecessors. But its presence reflects something real. A population that has been told for 30 years that reform is coming, that growth is returning, that patience is required, and that has increasingly stopped believing it. The political consequences of that disbelief have not yet reached their ceiling. James thought about this on his last night in Rome. He was eating alone at a small restaurant near the Pantheon. Cacio e pepe, the simplest thing on the menu, done with a perfection that still surprised him after 11 days of eating well. Around him, the restaurant was full. Tourists from 6 countries, a table of businessmen speaking German, a young Italian couple celebrating what appeared to be an anniversary. "This is what confuses me," he wrote in his notebook. "The country functions. At the level of individual life, individual craft, individual excellence, it functions magnificently. It is only at the level of the aggregate, the state, the system, the long term, that it seems unable to hold itself together." He paused and then added one more line. "Maybe that's not a failure of Italy. Maybe that's the definition of it. Italy is not finished." That sentence has been written about Italy for so long that it has become almost meaningless. And yet, it remains true. The productive assets are still there. The craftsmanship is still there. The brands are still there. The intellectual heritage, the design culture, the culinary tradition, the agricultural diversity, the sheer density of human capability concentrated in a relatively small peninsula, none of this has disappeared. What has disappeared, or what has never been adequately built, is the institutional layer that would allow these assets to compound rather than merely persist. There are genuine attempts at movement. The PNRR, the National Recovery and Resilience Plan, funded by European post-pandemic money, committed Italy to 191 billion euros of investment and reform, the largest allocation of European funds in the program's history. Digital infrastructure, judicial reform, green transition, public administration modernization. The list reads like a diagnosis of Italy's structural problems written by someone with access to both the problems and the checkbook. Whether the money will be spent, and spent well, is a different question. Italy's track record with large public investment programs is not encouraging, but the framework exists. The pressure from Brussels is real, and there are Italian politicians, administrators, and business leaders who understand that the window for serious reform is narrowing. The question that James could not answer, the question this film has tried to ask, is whether Italy's system can change at the speed the situation requires. The craftsmen of Prato and the engineers of Bergamo are already doing their part. So is Chiara, the young economist in Milan, though her part will be done in Munich. So is the factory owner who has built a successful export business despite everything the state has put in his way. The part that is missing is the one that only the state can play: the faster courts, the simpler tax code, the public schools that keep young people here instead of educating them for export, the infrastructure that connects the South to the North and both of them to Europe, the administrative capacity to spend money on things that work. These are not mysteries, they are choices. Italy knows what it needs to do. It has known for decades. The puzzle, the beautiful, maddening, very Italian puzzle, is why knowing and doing have remained so far apart. On his last morning, James Okafor walked to the Trevi fountain before the tourists arrived. It was just after 6. The piazza was empty except for a man cleaning the cobblestones with a machine that moved in slow, methodical arcs. The fountain was lit from below, 300 years old, still working, still extraordinary, still drawing millions of people every year to stand in front of it and feel something they cannot quite name. James stood there for a while. He thought about the train that had arrived 53 minutes late, about Chiara and her job offer in Munich, about the factory owner who succeeded despite the system, about the textile mills of Prato, and the shoe factories of the Brenta, and the restaurant near the Pantheon where the Cacio e Pepe was perfect. He thought about the man in the excellent suit who had said, "Beautiful country, the way you say something you have stopped believing will ever change." And then he thought, but it is. It genuinely is. The water moved in the same arcs it had moved for 3 centuries. The light came up over the rooftops. Somewhere behind him, the city was beginning its day, slowly, magnificently, in its own time, by its own logic, indifferent to the urgency of the numbers and the patience of the economists and the reports that would be written in glass-fronted offices in Brussels and filed and read and noted and perhaps eventually not quite forgotten. Italy doesn't need saving, he wrote finally on the last page of his notebook. It needs believing in itself as much as the rest of the world already believes in it. He put the notebook away. The cleaning machine made another slow arc across the cobblestones. The fountain kept running.